So one of the most interesting things about the Hartz reforms that no one talks about is that the job separation rate has fallen like a stone in Germany. Okay, so firms are clinging to their workers. Okay, so thanks for coming today. We're going to move to the final treatment of this Mortensen-Pisaries model, and then after that we're going to start doing search theory from scratch. We're going to start from the beginning of thinking about what's behind this black box, the matching function. Remember, the matching function is kind of a stand-in for a very complicated process. And the great thing about the Mortensen-Pisaries model is it sort of pushes this search process into a black box. One class. Too bad. Could have increased our attendance by 15%. Yeah, this is a shortcut. It's like the production function. You could also write down a macro model with heterogeneous agents, and every company has its own little production function, and then you can aggregate it. But that's it's kind of hard, and you need a computer for that. So this is one way of thinking about this is a shortcut. And when we stop today, we'll be finished with the Mortensen-Pisaries model. And if you want to go back into macroeconomics, you can use this model, and you can use a lot of the tricks that we're going to learn today to help us understand the way macroeconomic variables, including unemployment, interplay with each other. Okay? Now I see a question.
Yeah, the question might be a little bit off topic. It's regarding the term friction.
Yeah.
So if we, for example, have a model with a household with differentiated labor supply, so that labor are somehow different from each other. So this would imply that we have, for example, wages above the marginal rate of substitution, because households in some sort of market power. Would this be a friction, or?
Not in our sense. I mean, everything that takes you away from a Marshallian equilibrium in the old-fashioned sense, or an Arrow-Debreu equilibrium in the modern sense, is a friction. Okay, so the word is used very liberally. We're talking about search frictions, meaning that potential match is out there, but we just can't find it. And maybe it's because it's maybe due to a lot of different reasons. It could also be due to the fact that there's mismatch. Okay, it could be really the case that there are a lot of people who are trained to be coal miners, and there's a lot of jobs for programmers, but they just don't. You could actually put them together. You'd have to invest a lot of resources to train people to do other things. So that's a liberal interpretation of friction, but not as liberal as you'd like. I mean, if you want to, you can take any interference with the market clearing process, monopsony power, monopoly power, could also be taken as some sort of. We're not doing that in this course.
Okay.
Okay. Any other questions about this general stuff? So I was going to take the opportunity today to give you one more look at the Mortensen-Pisaries model in a stripped-down version. But first, I'm going to review the model, and then we're going to strip it. We're going to take down. God, that's the second time. Amazing. Okay. Maybe we should put a sign up. Mortensen-Pisaries, please stay away. So I'm going to try to convince you that this model is, if you're clever, if you have imagination, you can use this for a lot of things. And I say that meaning also in macro or in finance, you can use this model to think about finance. You can think about this to think about banking or hedge funds or whatever. Anytime you have informational frictions, you can use a kind of a search and matching model. And that's why this has been such a successful enterprise. Okay. So today we're going to talk about the last lecture again, and I'm going to review that Pisaries model very briefly orally, and then I'm going to review the Mortensen-Pisaries model as we discussed it last time, and that was a really very complicated, elaborated version. And then I'm going to strip it down. I'm going to set a lot of those parameters equal to 0 and see if we still get some intuition out of it. That's kind of it's kind of like going backwards. So I'm giving you a chance to catch your breath. This last time was kind of hard, I think. And Thomas is trying to keep up, and he's picking up all the pieces that I leave on the ground, and I don't want to leave too many pieces on the ground. I'm sure he's going to complain at some point. Okay, and then we're going to give ourselves a chance to critique the model using our economist thinking caps. So what are the weaknesses of this model, and can we do better? Okay, so we considered a policy-oriented version, sort of the maximum version of this model. It was put forward in a paper by the same authors 5 years after they published their original piece, that sort of showed how many policy tricks we can turn with this model, how many policy questions can we try to answer with this model. So it's really incredibly appealing to see that how much you can do with this. They even calibrate the model. They even try to take values for the parameters, even though we know it's a stand-in for a very complicated world, and they take parameters that look like the United States and some average European country, and then they ask the question, what would happen if we sort of swapped values? We gave the American economy European values, even though we calibrated it to American values, and then flopped the European, as if saying, what if Europe were to adopt American labor market institutions, what would happen to the unemployment rate and vacancy, unemployment, labor market tightness, and equilibrium. So it's a clever paper, got a lot of attention. And there's several things that we did, sort of en passant. I didn't really tell you much in detail, but you should probably think about it. What do we do? In that model we had actually sort of impermeable labor markets next to each other, all indexed by S. So in a sense, as long as you don't let people cross over, if you don't let doctors drive taxis and hospitals advertise for taxi cab drivers, it's a fine thing to do. You can actually just look at how relative wages could look, even though you don't have any real interaction between the labor markets. So it's kind of a bit of not really a cheat. It's just kind of showing the power of the model, but also showing the weaknesses, because maybe taxi drivers can be doctors, and maybe you can have all sorts of strange things going on, but it's just a way to allow for a lot of different labor markets existing side by side. But more importantly, the souped up version, that's an American expression. Souped up means kind of like a race car. The Germans would say getuned. It's eine getunte Version von Mertens and Pistorius 94, but allowing for a lot of different things to go on. And maybe by seeing that, you get a feel for what makes this model so special, okay? Because it gives you a perspective on the types of labor market policies we observe in the real world that cannot be really picked up very well by the standard Marshall analysis that we learned in my labor class, right? So you've taken that course, you know what I'm talking about. Okay, so why am I talking about that? Because we had unemployment insurance, that's easy, but of course unemployment insurance can be complicated. It can be based on your previous wage. It doesn't have to be a constant. It can be based on the amount of time you've already been unemployed. That would make people very different, because some people became unemployed yesterday. They would have prospectively several periods before they lose their benefit. Some people might be just before the benefit expiry, and that would change, of course, their behavior, and that's not in the model. So we can't go too far with that, but you get the impression that you can do more. You can have labor taxation. So I'm sure most of you know, I might ask you, what is the fraction of a worker's cost to a firm that's paid in terms of social contributions, unemployment insurance, health insurance, pension, disability? What do you think in Germany?
50?
50, that's a little high. Fraction of the cost to the employer. Okay, so you've hit the upper bound. There are very few countries that have hit 50%, but you're thinking the right way. I'm not saying it's good or bad. It's just something you should be aware of. And it's true. It's also true of other OECD countries like Italy or France or Canada. Anybody take a guess? 30 to 35%. That's a pretty good ballpark number for most European countries. In the United States, it's much less. It's about 15%. Okay, but it's still a lot. So this is money you never see. It's kind of help. You may see it in some long-term sense. You may get benefits from it. It's a good question, by the way, for the exam. A third. Okay. So in Germany, it's really about a third right now. In France, it's about 35%, 36%. In Spain, during the recession, it was as high as 40%. In Greece, it's up there. And a lot of it has to do with just the way the system's designed. Okay, so that's something that you can put in the Mortensen-Pizzarese model right away. Drive a wedge between what the worker gets and what the firm actually has to pay. The cost of recruitment. So what does it cost to find a worker? If you have frictions, you have to find a worker. And that's why big companies have personnel departments. They have Personalvorstand. They have a guy who actually is paid millions of euros a year just to organize 30,000 employees or 300,000 employees, that sort of thing. It's a lot of work. So you have to pay for the recruiting, interviews, and the like. That's all in the Mortensen-Pizzarese model. You've got active labor market policies. The government could be intervening to make it easier to find workers. It could be intervening to make it less painful for workers to get hired, for example. Even though the government's taking money away for Social Security, it might be giving money if you hire the workers, so it's a little bit like a bait and switch thing. You could also have training costs and apprenticeships, so there's all sorts of cool stuff. And the Marshall sort of supply and demand, Hicks-Marshall rule, just doesn't go very far. So you know this is kind of why we're doing this course. Okay, so we started with the matching function. A lot of this is review, but I do think it's worth seeing it again, because next week we really will work with a completely different set of tools. In dealing with individual decisions and optimality, optimal stopping, for example, when you stop looking, when you accept a job. Okay, and how do you plan to find a job? It's kind of useful for you someday, maybe when you go out and look for a job. And we have this thing called matching function. Thomas has talked about it a lot. I've talked about it a lot. We're going to stick with this linear homogeneous function, meaning that if the size of the economy, meaning U and V taken as a whole, you scale it up by some fraction, or scale it down by some fraction, or scale it up by some factor, it doesn't affect the relative effectiveness of this matching process. Okay, so the success rate of a matching function in Luxembourg versus Germany, according to this assumption, is irrelevant as long as the ratio of vacancies to unemployment or unemployment vacancies has the same value. Okay, so again, it's kind of it's not saying that you can't get certain effects on matching more or less over time or with policy interventions, but it's just not a function of the size of the market. It's kind of a very important assumption. And it kind of, it goes along with your intuition. I mean, the unemployment rate in Germany is not much different from the unemployment rate in Luxembourg. Maybe it's a little bit higher now, but probably was a little bit lower a few decades ago. There's no presumption that a big country has an inherent advantage or disadvantage in matching. And you could say, well, what about a local labor market? What about Kreuzberg? Small region, small labor skill class. Well, you can tell stories where there might be increasing returns to scale. So if you double unemployment, double vacancies, you actually get more than double the number of matches per period, because it's a flow. Remember, this is a flow as a function of two stocks. Stock of unemployment, stock of vacancies, giving rise to a flow per unit period. Okay, so again, this is review, but I should say it again. The statistic for us is theta. It's a sufficient statistic. You'll see later that it's also a sufficient statistic for determining the wage. Okay, it's going to actually fall out of the model. In the stripped down model, it's much more clear to see that. And you can calculate, in some sense, your success probability as a firm trying to post a vacancy as a function of this theta. Again, big market, small market. As long as that theta is the same, it doesn't matter. What matters is the ratio. For unemployment workers, it's a transform of that. It would be theta times the success rate for the finding rate for vacancies. Okay, so you can do all the math on your own. You can see that that it really is. It's going to be important for us, and it's going to be one of the statistics we look at. So right now in Germany, theta is really high. It's been really high for the past 3 or 4 years. It's amazing. In fact, it's been rising since the Hartz reforms, and it's been cycling. So it's gone a little bit down it went down a little bit in the crisis, the financial crisis, and it's come back. But the trend is positive right now. So you have a feeling this is a lower frequency, long-term type of development. It can also go the other way. In the 1970s, theta was on its way down in many European countries. So there's all sorts of food for thought here. And I told you already to use this, and we'll do this next week in detail, thinking about the duration of unemployment spells as a function of the matching of the finding rate from a worker's perspective, or thinking about the duration of a posted vacancy ex ante before you start. Obviously you might get lucky and place the vacancy right away, fill it right away. It might take many periods, but on average, if you integrate that over the density of durations, you're going to get 1 over Q for the vacancy. You're going to get 1 over F, or 1 over theta times Q for unemployment. So those are really important statistics. Now, everyone's the same in this model. So you say, well, I know a guy who's been unemployed for 5 years, okay? In this model, it's just a very unlucky individual. But in fact, it might have something to do with your personal attributes or your friend's attributes. And we don't know enough yet to talk about that. Okay, so keep that in mind. Let me just remind you, in this souped up version, I'm just going to review it, and then I'm going to go into detail. S now doesn't stand for the separation rate anymore, it stands for the skill level, and it goes between 0 and 1. And that it's exogenous, it just scales productivity. So the S equals 1 is like the doctors with a PhD and computer science degree and really skilled people, and then S equals close to 0, someone doesn't have any schooling or whatever. Okay? And those are segmented labor markets, so we're just taking S as an extra indicator of productivity. And the Pizzarini's model, in the Mortensen-Pizzarini's model, your productivity changes. In the Pizzarini's model, it didn't change, but in the Mortensen-Pizzarini's, you start at 1, and then after that, the clock starts ticking in some sense. These events arrive with some random probability, and sometimes you're pulling from the same distribution. Sometimes you get a decent draw, sometimes you get a lousy draw. The distribution of the shock, or the value of X after the shock occurs, is coming from a time invariant distribution. Okay, so you're standing in front of the same urn, pulling. If you get hit with a shock, you just have to put your hand in the same urn with replacement, and you pull a different productivity. Okay, so this lambda is going to be important for us. As you know, it's going to be kind of the underlying churning in the economy. So in a high lambda economy, you could think of like working in the Austrian Alps, in the ski instructor business, or I said this last time, working in southern Spain in the agricultural sector. Okay, almost with clockwork, you're going to lose your job because there's no more oranges, you can't pick them anymore, and that's going to mean that those kind of sectors or industries or countries will have higher underlying lambdas, and then given the lambda, they might have a different shock distribution as well. Okay? So we can already spin that into a bunch of interesting facts, because the model, and we'll go into detail next week, we start talking about the reservation wage model, the way of deciding when to stop looking. This model already has it hardwired. So these random encounters of posted vacancies in workers, basically, if an encounter occurs, the match is a success. But once you're in the match, things can change. And then there's going to be a threshold value under which the match is basically not worth the while of either the worker or the firm. Okay, so that's going to be critical. And that's going to be a time invariant value. It's going to be a constant that falls out of the model under certain settings for the parameters, and that will kind of determine the job, if you like, the separation rate, the dissolution rate, which would be lambda, the probability of having a shock in a very small interval time, times the probability that the shock brings a new value of X fourth that is less than R. So that would be big F of R. So it's the CDF evaluated at the reservation. So you can see that's a constant in the equilibrium, but R can change. So if R is high, that means the threshold value is rather high, so given a shock occurring, it's more likely to lead to the dissolution of the match. So think of R as a measure of fragility of the match. The closer R, so what's the maximum value that R can take in this model, you think? You must know if you've been paying attention.
1.
Right. So if you're really bad, if you really got bad luck, you know, R is equal to 1, so you know, it's not even worth starting, right? Now, if R is very low, that means that it's going to be a fairly durable situation. So you could have lots of, you know, a lot of mass of shocks will not lead to the job blowing up for you. Okay, and again, remember the worker and the firm are in the same boat. There's no conflict here. Given that they're together, they both have some reason to stay together. Okay, so you can even push this model further, and we're not going to do that in this class, but you could actually invoke some disagreement or stickiness to make it, the worker says, hey, I want to stay with you, I think I'm productive enough, and the firm says, no, you're fired. Okay, that's a different model. Here, we both see it coming, you know, we've got maybe the industry's going down the drain, or the other things are happening that make the match just not productive. Okay, so that's the way we want to think about this. So think about what Pissarides called his S would be like lambda times F of R. Okay, so again, we have unemployment, we have employment, there's no possibility of being in a third state, and the supply of workers is inelastic. Okay, it's equal to 1. So it's easy for us to track. The supply of vacancies, on the other hand, think of just there's a pool, a very large pool of entrepreneurs that can jump in and post a vacancy whenever it makes sense to do so. Okay, and we'll see that that's basically a condition that says, is capital V positive or is it negative? If it's positive, then that means the value of having a vacancy in the market is not 0. So if it doesn't cost anything to enter, it just costs money to post the vacancy every period. It makes sense to post another vacancy. So that would push capital V down towards 0. If capital V is negative, then vacancies are, you know, you're fishing for a losing proposition. So you would just exit the market. It wouldn't cost anything to exit the market, and you'd save yourself some money. Save yourself posting a vacancy. So V equals 0 is an equilibrium condition. And again, going back to the very beginning of the course, the first lecture we talked about the time derivative of the unemployment rate, which is the same thing as the unemployment stock because the labor force is equal to 1. So it's easy to move back and forth. That unemployment rate evolves over time as a race between the inflows into unemployment from employment minus the outflows out of unemployment into employment. Okay, so when you set that equal to 0, we have the equilibrium rate of unemployment. Literally the equilibrium rate of unemployment. So this model, not surprisingly, is often used in macro as a way of kind of thinking about the NAIRU, although there's no inflation in this model, so you have to have an idea of what causes inflation. It has to have something to do with the unemployment rate, but there's no money and there's no inflation in this model. So don't think about that too hard, but think about the equilibrium unemployment rate. I think it's a race between the numerator, the inflow rate, and if you like, the denominator, which is kind of like a turbulence measure or turnover measure in the labor market. And that's, of course, dominated by the second term, which is the outflow rate. So it's the rate of exits from the bathtub. Okay, Thomas, I think started talking about the wage. You started to derive the wage, or did you? Okay, so this is really important. Again, this is a model of, it's like a dream for people who think the world is flexible and can just, you know, it's an exaggeration, but it kind of gives you an idea of how far this can take you. So the idea is that once you're in a match with a firm as a worker, you are constantly looking at the gains and costs of being in that match. And your compensation is just a way of splitting that match, that surplus. So we're going to derive that, and you've seen it already, we'll do it again. It's a way of allocating the surplus. So it doesn't have the same interpretation you have in a Marshallian model where you have the marginal rate of substitution and comparing that with the marginal product of labor from the firm side, and you have some sort of, you don't have that anymore. Because once you've matched, it's a one or zero thing. It's a 1 or 0 decision. And the bargain wage is going to reflect how much this match is worth to you and how much it's worth to the firm. Okay, so we use the Nash concept to figure that out. So we have all these institutions. I'll remind you, we have so you have this unemployment income. We'll keep to that. You can have this wage contingent unemployment insurance. You can make it contingent on an average wage, which is some countries you actually have a cap on it. So in Germany you can't, if you're really, really well-paid executive and you become unemployed, you can't get 30% or 50% of that or 60% of that. It's usually capped, so they can think of that as a way of getting that into the model. You have a lot of times in some countries, a lot of countries, you have subsidies. If you hire a worker, you get a little bit of money from the government, or maybe you get some money from the EU or something like that. And making it depend on the skill level is just a way of saying, okay, well, if you want to become a doctor, maybe if you get hired by a hospital, there may be a larger subsidy. Okay, and of course, if you want to lay off somebody, there may be a higher cost of losing that worker. That's also the part of this. And these costs are not paid to the worker; they're paid to some third party. So it's a little bit like having a lawyer, having to get a lawyer if you want to fire somebody. And then you've got this firing tax, which is hiring cost would be the cost of hiring a worker. The firing tax would be the cost of getting rid of the worker. You have the bargaining power we talked about, and there's always this vacancy posting cost. And in this particular model, it's made dependent on the skill level. So you pay more, you have to go to a headhunter to get a really high-powered manager, whereas if you're looking for someone to do simple work, it would be less costly. That's just the implicit assumption. So again, reviewing this, I know Thomas has talked about, we're going to do a stripped-down version of section in a second. But just to get you to understand this asset approach to valuing the state. And if you have any questions, please ask me, because this is really a really important point. The idea is that think of each one of these labor market states, respectively for the worker and for the firm, as being sort of like an asset. And it has a value, and if you could sell it, you'd get cash for it, or you could get real resources for it, and then you could lend it to somebody, and then you could get some interest for that. So that's kind of the arbitrage argument. And if an employer has a worker in hand, it's worth J to him or to her, and it depends on X. It depends on productivity right now. And maybe you started at 1, like you do in this model, but maybe after a few periods it's changed and now it's X. So given that it's X, what is it worth to me? Well, if it were worth J, and I put that money in the bank for an instant, I'd get R times J. So it's the yield on the implicit asset at the constant rate of little r. So that should be equated to the actual value of having that asset, actually having a worker in hand. You get productivity Sx. You have to pay some tax A. You have to pay T, little t times W, and you have to pay the worker W, and that wage depends on X. It depends on the state of the worker's productivity. So that thing can change over time. Given that it's X right now, that's what the firm would see coming to it, would see Sx coming to it, and then has to pay the worker W of X. Okay, and the rest looks nasty, but that's the fun part. That's the fun part because it says what in the next instant something can happen. With a probability lambda, something is going to happen, which is, if you like, good or better than bad, meaning that I pull up a value of X that's greater than R, and then I have to ask, okay, what's the value of my job relationship conditional on having a value of X that's greater than R? So that's the fourth term in this expression. It's actually the first integral, okay? It would go from R to 1, and it's basically, you're taking the density of this shock, Z, and that's dF, because F is the cumulative distribution, and we're multiplying that by all the potential values of J at Z, valuing going from capital R to 1. So you're taking all the possible values and you're weighting them with the probabilities coming from that density function. So think of that as the expected value of the change in the value of this asset, J, okay, and that's why you have this dummy variable of integration Z. Okay, so again, the math may come easy to you, you may have to stare at it for a while, but it's really not that hard. It's an expected value. But again, it's all conditioned on having a shock. So if nothing happens, nothing happens. So you just pay your worker and you go home. Okay, now the bad thing is it could actually lead to a dissolution of the match, and that's the last term. The last term is with this Poisson parameter lambda indicating the probability in the next instance something happens, and then the stuff that happens is not good. So you pull a value of x that's below the threshold value of r, so you're going to get this capital loss, which is the value of going back to the market and looking for a worker again because you've lost a worker. Okay, and then what do you have to pay? Well, you're losing the job. That's j of x, so that gets subtracted off, and you also have to pay this tax. So you have to go to the Arbeitsamt and pay them, and that's one possible way of thinking about it. You also have to pay a lawyer just to execute the dissolution, the severance, or the dissolution of the match, if you like. Okay, so it's a complicated equation, but it kind of makes sense because it's kind of a dynamic. It's a dynamic way of thinking about it. We call them continuation equations for these states. And if you can see, there's actually, abstracting from this one, there are four equations. The second equation is the worker's perspective in a job. The worker's got a job. What's it worth to him? It's worth capital W. Again, if you could capitalize that and take the interest rate times that capitalized value, that must be worth the wage. Okay, and remember the wage is a gross wage. Net wage to the worker. The gross wage is paid by the firm as above. And then you've got this probability that two things can happen. One is you get a shock, and given the shock occurs, you have to change your value of x, and things could get better. In that case, WZ evaluated the new x would be greater than WX at the old x, and you have to integrate over all the values that are potentially relevant. That would go from the integral would go from capital R to 1. And then you've got the probability in this next instant that something bad happens, in the sense that the new x is below the critical value. So then you're unemployed, right? The match dissolves, so you have a capital loss of u minus w of x. Okay, so again, this is I'm spending time on this because, well, Thomas is going to do it again. It's really important. First off, it's a contingent value, and it depends on the value of x. In the Piss-Rees model, the productivity of worker in the job was constant. Didn't change at all, right? So it's kind of easy to play with that model, but it's not a completely realistic way of thinking of the world. Okay, and then I'm going to skip the third equation, and we'll come back to it in a second. The fourth equation says that the vacancy posting state for the firm, which in equilibrium we're going to set is equal to 0 because there'll be free entry and exit until all the potential entrants are indifferent between doing nothing and entering. That's going to be what? If you have a vacancy posted, you have to pay the cost of the vacancy. That's SK. Okay, so you have to pay that anyway. And if you're successful with probability Q, you get something. And you get basically J0, which is the value of having someone in the job at the very beginning. 0 is there for a special reason. And then it's a capital gain because then you don't have to pay the vacancy. You don't have the vacancy state anymore, so it's J0 minus V. And then you may have to pay something for this worker to start working with you. And the worker has skill S times what? The cost of hiring the worker minus the hiring subsidy that the firm would get from the government or from some outside agent. Okay, so that whole term inside the brackets is the capital gain that you get from finding a worker. So you posted a vacancy and voila, you got lucky. And again, the model is cooked, so when you first start working, x equals 1. So it's a great favor that Piss-Rees does for us. I mean, Mortons and Piss-Rees does because it makes it easier to play with it. And then after that, things start to change, possibly. And we should think of it in those terms. If you're unemployed, you have the same perspective looking at a possible hire. If you don't get hired, you get B. It's like some income and unemployment. And again, the fancy souped up model says you're getting some fraction of some average wage. That's what we have here. Plus some expected value of getting a job. If you get a job, you get W0. Woo, okay. Start productivity 1, sharing that rent with the employer, and you're no longer unemployed. So it's a capital gain. It's W0 minus U. So I took a long time to explain that slide because it's probably worth looking at. Later on, I'm going to come to those 4 equations, those valuation equations, without all that fancy stuff, and you'll see that it's basically a bunch of very simple ideas. Now the third line is supposed to make everything compatible with voluntary trade. Okay, so there may be situations where the reservation productivity from the perspective of the firm is different from the perspective of the worker. Okay, so it is the case, then you want to take the max because you can't force anybody to do anything in this model. Now we'll eventually, this is a complexity, but I think you should be aware that we do have involuntary separations. We do have involuntary turnover. In this model, we're going to rule that out. Okay, so we'll eventually just move away from that, but you should always be aware there should be voluntary trade, and the second part of that line basically defines those reservation values. So this should help you understand where the firm's reservation concept comes from. The firm should be indifferent at R sub E between continuing in that job with that worker or going off and posting a vacancy and trying to start all over again. But if it does that, it has to pay ST. Okay, so it's an arbitrage type of condition. In the same way, the worker looking for a job has to be indifferent between going back into unemployment or staying in this lousy job. Okay, so you can see the cool thing about the Pizarese model was that you had this turnover, but in the Mortensen-Pizarese model, you have different workers. If I just put my hand in the employment pool and pull out a match, it's going to be different. Some guys are going to be really productive and they're going to be really happy, and some guys are going to be kind of, sidling along the reservation level. And again, the model is clever and cool enough that it actually allows all that stuff to coexist. So it's kind of like a heterogeneous agent model, but you don't have to carry any baggage. You don't have to track individuals because everything is because there's no wealth here. The workers aren't saving. They're not like optimizing utility using assets and the like. So it's a really, it's a good way to start thinking about heterogeneity in these models. Yeah.
Yeah. There's a new match. So if a firm finds a new worker, always starts with an x equal to 1.
That's the assumption of Mortensen-Pizarese.
Okay.
Now there's some other models. Valerie Ramey has a model, and some of her co-authors, other people have had models, and we'll get to that when we start talking about search at the individual level, because there's no reason to think that you run into a job that's going to be the top of the line, so you will have rejections. So in this model, you have no optimal rejections of job offers. Every time you come together in the bathtub, something happens, and it's just to make it easy for you to understand. But ultimately, we know that when you encounter job offers, sometimes they're lousy, and you can actually, as a worker, say, no, I don't want to do that. Okay, so that, again, that's the next step. So we're trying to move in a linear fashion. Okay, but it's a good question. Okay, so the wage. Today we'll do it in detail, but again, just to reference the last lecture, the wage is complicated because you're splitting the surplus, and because of all these frictions that we have, and this is where I like to think about frictions. You have a friction of when you hire a worker, you've got to find the worker, then you have to pay this fixed hiring cost, and if you get rid of the worker or you split up, you have to pay this firing cost. Those are also kind of like frictions, and these frictions have an effect on the wage. And this will not be a characteristic of the original Mortensen-Pizarese model. But because of, I tell you a story. If you go to work for somebody in Germany, okay, generally you don't have job protection for the first 2 years. That's the way it works, okay? And there's usually even more severe is this so-called, Einarbeitungszeit, what's it called in German?
Probezeit.
Probezeit, yeah. Okay, so if we have a Probezeit, that means like a trial period of 6 months. That means that the firm can get rid of you at a drop of a hat. You know, you make a face of the guy, you're gone. Okay, if he wants. Okay, so that's kind of what this is trying to get at. You meet a worker in the bathtub, okay, and you know that if you're an employer and you sign this worker on with you, as soon as the ink is dry and something bad happens, you have to pay ST. But before that, you don't have to pay ST. Okay, so in a sense you have a little bit of advantage, a bargaining advantage at the beginning when you negotiate that first wage. So this is Mortensen Pizzerides 99. They figured out that W0, the initial wage, is going to be a little bit different from the contract wage that follows as soon as you've signed on the bottom line and the ink is dry. Because when the ink is dry, the next shock comes along and the worker says, I know if you fire me, if we go apart, because it's not really a firing, if we split up, you have to pay ST. So my negotiating advantage vis-a-vis you has improved. But until you sign that, there is no ST. Okay? So this is just a way to alert you to that. It won't be relevant in the stripped down version, but it comes from the fact that you have this ST in case of a dissolution, and the firm has to pay that. Okay? All right, so there are two max problems, two Nash bargaining problems to be solved. The first one is at the very beginning before the ink is dry, and then the second one is after the ink is dry. Because when the ink is dry, then I have to pay ST to this third party. It's a friction, if you like, and the worker knows that and takes advantage of it. Okay. So that's a really cool aspect of this. And the first order conditions, if you take those two Nash problems separately, would look like that. And you can see then it shows up. In the first one, you actually see the C minus H, but you don't see any T. And after you've got the worker on board, you don't have to pay C and H anymore, but you'd have to pay T. Okay, remember S is the skill level, it's just the exogenous skill scalar. So the scaling effect. Okay, so you solve that, you can write down the first order condition, you can assume that you've reached that J today and J in the next instant is the same, and you can solve for the wage as soon as you impose the zero profit condition. Okay, and the last condition is something just to keep you cognizant of the fact that everyone's voluntary in this world, so you cannot force anybody to do anything. There's a participation constraint, if you like. So the matches have to basically have a surplus that's positive, right? We're not in the GDR with making trabants. Okay, I mean, if you have value subtraction, your company's making a loss at world prices, you just shut it down, and that's exactly what's happening here. The surplus at the reservation level of productivity has to give you exactly zero surplus. That's how we're going to define, that's how we're going to get capital R in this model. Okay, so it's like, how bad does it have to get between you and me before we say, let's get divorced? Okay, we talked about that last time. It's like Brexit. You can think about Brexit that way. Okay, and this is the souped up version. What we're going to do in a second is much simpler than this, but it's just so cool to watch this. You can see the wage changing its face as you move through time. So we've had our successful job interview, assessment center, and I say, that's great to see you, here's my wage offer, and you gladly accept it, and as soon as the ink is dry, your smile turns into this, and you realize, now I can get my boss. I know he has to pay me more if we have a shock. Okay, so you can just look at those two equations. Those both describe the wage. The first one describes the wage when the ink is not dry yet, okay, and x equals 1. And then as soon as the first shock occurs, it's a different wage equation. Okay, so that's really a function of these frictions. And I'm sure you'll take a look at this. You should take a look at it. And the text is a little bit hard to read. With all due respect, Dale Mortensen is a bit difficult to read, but we're going to try to make you aware of this. This is the diagram I'm going to show you in a few minutes. This is the MP diagram, if you like. Okay, so It's plotting the two relevant endogenous variables. Remember, in the Pisarides model, we had unemployment and vacancies. We had vacancies in the vertical, unemployment on the horizontal. Now we've got the ratio of those guys on the horizontal. Because remember, theta is vacancies divided by unemployment. It's a sufficient statistic for the tightness of the labor market. When theta is high, it's good for you if you're a worker. It's bad for you if you're an employer. Because the higher the theta is, the harder it is to place a vacancy, and the easier it is to find a job. It's logical, right? That's the way it works. So we have two conditions, two equations in theta and r that uniquely determine theta and r. And everything we've got in the model basically can be forced into one of those two curves. And comparative statics is a little bit harder because you have to use calculus, but it's easy in the end. It's also easy, you can actually just look at the curve long enough and you can say, okay, if theta goes up, everything else is constant, what has to happen to r? It's kind of the classic, sort of what I do in macro. When I teach you macro 1, for those of you taking me with macro 1, you know, it's like really kind of bozo economics, but it's useful. I think bozo economics is very useful. Okay, so this is the way we're going to describe this equation. We've got basically a wage equation, and this is the second equation is the so-called job creation condition. It's kind of like thinking about it in terms of a demand curve for labor, but it's not quite the same thing. It basically says that the higher theta is, for a job creator, the less productive it has to be at the threshold to make it worth your while. Okay, and on the other hand, the JD curve is a measure, is a way of assessing the destruction margin. At what level does a job become not worth maintaining from the perspective of both worker and the firm? And the tighter the labor market is, basically the higher that critical value of R is going to be. I'm going to derive this in detail in a second, so I'm going to show you the conditions. We'll talk through the logic in a second. But think of the job destruction margins basically tracing out the fragility associated with the marginal match as a function of labor market tightness. So in really tight labor markets, it's going to be really hard to get a job to survive a long time because it has to be very productive. Fragility is higher. So that's the destruction condition, and it's upward sloping. Okay, so once you've gotten that down, you can talk through, and we'll do this in detail, all the different possible comparative statics. And this is the easy, you can think of higher skill levels. What would a higher skill labor market look like? Which curves would shift? What if you have a higher incidence probability, lambda? What if the benefit is higher? We already talked about that in the Pisarides model context. What if workers' bargaining power is higher? And what about this severance tax? So you can talk through all those different outcomes, and you can see that sometimes they're not exactly unambiguous. So an increase in the severance tax, remember this is a payment to a third party for breaking up. It's like a divorce lawyer. You know? It has an ambiguous effect on employment. So this is where being a trained economist actually is good for you, because a lot of people say, oh, it's obvious you raise the tax on firing, you're going to have higher unemployment. Well, it's not the case. It means that firms will be less likely to hire, but it also means they'll be less likely to fire. So the outcome of those two is actually it's not unambiguous. Okay, so let me show you what they did in 1999 with their paper, and then I'm going to go back and strip down the MP model, very, very basic, and you'll see all this stuff will jump in your face. It'll be very easy to identify, okay? So, you can look at these. To do this kind of stuff, to do policy with this model, you have to calibrate it. So you have to take it really seriously. And this is like in modern macroeconomics, you calibrate models. You tune them so they match averages and second moments and possibly correlations and spectra and all sorts of other things. And so this is what they did. This is a model that has no cycle. It's a static model. Okay, so what they did was they said, okay, we're going to try really hard to make this model look like the United States and like Europe. Okay, so here's what they did. They took some stuff off the shelf, basically, or out of the statistical data, and they tried to make U.S. and Europe as similar as possible. So this is kind of a, you might say this is not realistic because Americans are different from Europeans. Fine, you can think of that. There's no preference, there's no leisure in this model, so it's kind of hard to put it on that. You could put the difference on the unemployment benefit. Okay, you could also put it on the value of leisure. So they took this very seriously. They said Americans and French and Germans have the same value of leisure in monetary terms, but they have different unemployment benefits. Okay, so they have if you look at the last line here, they calibrate the model to have a replacement rate for unemployment insurance in Europe, which is significantly higher than in the United States. So 35% versus 20%. They also put a huge firing tax in Europe. In America, it's very easy to lay off workers if your employer has certainly a special effect on workers' behavior, because workers are always kind of living with this fear. But of course, there are a lot more jobs out there you can get. So some people say that's kind of compensation for that. So if you look at the way this model is calibrated, 78% of the productivity in a period, which is a quarter of this model, is the severance cost for the European employer. Okay, and the rest is the same. So they take those institutions and they solve for it under a certain set of alternative assumptions for high skilled and low skilled, and they look at the changes in unemployment moving from one to the other. Okay, so you can see that moving to a European, for the high skill has very little effect on the unemployment rate. That's kind of what you'd think, because these guys are skilled, they're producing a lot in a match, so it's not going to have a whole lot of effect on their labor market outcome. But if you look at the low skilled, you see there's a much larger effect. Okay, so unemployment is really affected in an adverse way in this model, even though it's ambiguous. For that particular parameter constellation, it's actually, that's the advantage of using a computer to solve the model with a particular set of assumptions, is you actually get a concrete answer. Okay, so they also talk about, it's quite an interesting paper. They look at subsidies, because Europeans like subsidies. In France, they give subsidies for people working at the minimum wage, because they have to pay such high social security taxes. So it's like you're taking money and you're giving it back. But it's worth thinking about, and you can, in this model, different effects for different skill levels. By the way, P in their paper is my S, so just to make sure you understand that. And they also look at taxing high-skilled workers. You could think of it having a tax on skill or a subsidy on low skill, but I won't go into it. So now we're gonna take a breather. We're gonna just take a deep breath and look under the hood, as it were. So when you buy a used car, you always want to look at the engine, see how dirty it is, whether it has a hole in it or something. So we're going to look under the hood of the MP model and look at a very simple version. Just talk through that again. Maybe you have some questions, and then we're going to go into the critical mode and ask why this model is not the end of the analysis. Okay. So we're going to set the skill level equal to 1. So it's just one market, right? We're going to set the firing cost equal to 0. We're going to set hiring cost equal to 0. We're going to set any sort of government policy on subsidizing to 0. No taxes. We're going to have a flat unemployment benefit. And you can think of this as your unemployment income, or you can think of a flat benefit regardless of your skill level. Okay, so just to get an idea of how this model works, I'm going to use C instead of K because that's what Pissarides does. And again, everything is before with Q and F. Remember, the matching function. So look how simple the valuation equations look now. Remember all that other stuff we had in there? It's all gone. Okay, so you still have the same logic. And just to make things tricky for you, I sorted it by workers versus firms instead of putting the two employed states. So now you have to think about it a little bit. So workers have two possibilities. They can have a job or they can be unemployed. And if they have work, if they're employed, the valuation of that asset will depend on their productivity in the job at that particular point in time, which is X. So it's a state contingent valuation. And it depends on the instantaneous wage for that little instant of time that the worker gets. And there's no taxes. The worker gets what he gets, she gets. And then two things can happen. No shock occurs or a shock occurs. Okay. And if you like, actually three things can happen. Shock can occur, and if a shock occurs, it can be a good thing or it can be a bad thing. So that's a little bit like we had before. So if a shock occurs and and again I've rewritten it a little bit just to make you think about it, you get the value of unemployment in the next instant, which is U prime, and the probability of that shock occurring is capital F of R. So there is given the reservation value in the economy for the match, that will be the effective probability, expected value of that component of the asset, the probability of a shock that's bad and you move into unemployment. Okay, probability of the shock occurring and you have some improvement in your productivity. You would integrate W prime over the interval from R to 1. And then of course there's a probability of 1 minus lambda that nothing happens. Okay. R, the same logic. And then for firms, again, the same type of logic as before. Okay, so the firms take the valuation of the future as given, and the workers take the valuation of the future as given as well. The wage solves a much simpler problem, and the wage function will be the same for x equals 1 at the beginning as for any other value of x. Okay, so it's a much easier problem. X equals 1 when they meet. The first order condition is a match sharing condition, so the worker's surplus, defined as W of x minus U, which is what the worker gets if the worker becomes employed, is a fraction of the total surplus of the match, which is the sum of J and W minus U minus V. Okay, so that's just a classic Nash problem leads to a first order condition. Given that the workers can't influence future match values, it's just going to split whatever surplus it has, and that's going to lead to this sharing rule. Okay, and if we're dealing with a steady state situation where J equals J prime, etc., V equals V prime, W equals W prime, U equals U prime, then it's easy just to rearrange, again imposing this zero profit condition. You can get the following expression, which is that the wage depends on a weighted average of what it's worth to the firm and what it's worth to the worker. And the alternative, the fallback position. Okay? And if you impose the zero profit condition on vacancies and then ask what happens when x equals 1 at the beginning, when you meet, you're always going to have the same value of x. You basically can find the conditions that define this job creation curve that I had already. So it's tracing out this negative relationship between this reservation productivity. Okay, so that's the value of productivity that, prospectively from the firm's perspective, would make it worth its while to engage at value R versus tightness in the labor market summarized by theta. Okay, so it's a negative relationship, and you can differentiate that expression totally. You can also talk through the logic. So if I raise theta, that reduces Q. Q is in the denominator, so that means that the left-hand side goes up. So how do you get the right-hand side to go up? You have to reduce R. That's the non-calculus way of telling the story. Okay? You're lucky because most stories in calculus can't be told like that. You have to actually do this nasty derivative. Okay? But again, you can talk through the logic of why the JC curve is downward sloping. And if it helps you think about it, it's a little bit like a demand curve. Think of R as kind of a price. It's the price of the worst possible match, okay? And under what conditions would that worst possible match be consistent with labor market tightness theta? Okay, and why is that the case? Well, remember, labor market tightness determines the success probability of a firm finding a worker, and that's Q. So think of C over Q as the capitalized value of posting a vacancy until you place the job. So remember, we already said that 1 over Q is like the expected time a firm needs before it can actually fill its job. It might be lucky it gets it right away, it might take several periods of waiting and waiting and waiting. So think of C over Q as the expected vacancy posting cost for the firm on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side are the expected benefits. Okay, so the firm is going to have to give away beta to the worker and has to give P, that's the productivity. And then you can think of as 1 minus R as kind of the surplus, that would be available at this worst possible marginal cutoff value. And then you're kind of discounting. This is going to require a little bit of thought, but if you think about it, you don't just get it for one period, you get it potentially for a long time, but there's always a probability of something happening. Okay, one way of thinking about that is theta. So theta is like a discount rate. Think of it as a discounting factor. It's not a very, it's probably not a completely intuitive intention, but you think of this 1 minus R divided by R plus theta is like a capitalized value of having a worker in hand. Okay, so you can use calculus to show this thing is negatively sloped, as I said. Now the other curve is the one that's positively sloped, and this is the condition that doesn't determine how you when you create a job or under what conditions jobs will be created, for which values of theta and R. It determines basically at what values do matches no longer have a rationale for existing. So if a match is really unproductive, then worker and firm both agree this is time to hang up. It's like time to have Brexit, time to break up, get divorced, whatever you like. Okay, so this cutoff value is what we call R. And you can think of this as, there's several different perspectives for understanding this. I mean, one way of thinking about it is the value of the match has to be giving the worker enough to make it worth that worker's while to stay in. Okay? And thinking about the tightness in the labor market, when theta is high, V over U is high, which is a lot of vacancies for few workers, and the value of unemployment is going to be quite large because it's easy to find a job. Okay? Why is that going to matter? Well, the firm is paying this vacancy cost C all the time, which means the worker has kind of an extra advantage in the match because the firm pays a C every period and also kind of, if you like, will be paying that for a very long time depending on how tight the labor market is. So this is kind of a way of thinking about the fallback position of the worker. And if you think about the job destruction decision, it's basically asking under what conditions is the value of that job at X equals R. Is that what value of R is that J equal to 0? So that's this condition. Okay, if you go back to the state valuation equations as before, and you set J of R equals 0, you can solve for it, and you get the following equation, which says, in a sense, on the left-hand side you have at the value of R, you have productivity R times P, which is the productivity in this, again, P is a scaling value for productivity, I forgot to tell you that. And then the second term is the option value that something may get better, because there may be a shock. The shock occurs with some probability lambda, and if it does occur, then things can get better. So in some sense, the destruction margin that makes a firm indifferent between closing the job, or the firm and the worker jointly close the job, has to also account for the fact that things might get better. That's the second part. Think of that as an option value of an improvement in the match in the next instant. Okay? And that basically gets set to the worker's indifference condition with being unemployed. So that's the value of unemployment for the worker. And if you plug in the first condition into the second, you get the JD curve, okay, which is positively sloped. And the positive slope says that basically the higher labor market tightness is, the more tenuous the jobs will be, and the more likely they'll get destroyed. And the R that's consistent with this cutoff value will be higher. Okay, so both of those conditions have to hold at the same time. So you have the job creation condition, that's the downward sloping curve, and you have this upward sloping condition, the JD curve. Okay, so again, this is what we had before, but now you see it again. You simplified equations, and we're asking basically what value of theta in the steady state, what value of labor market tightness is consistent with a cutoff value of R that is common to all firms. So whether a firm is already employing a worker for a long time or just hired a worker, the model is cooked such that there's a common value of R. There's a common threshold value. Should a shock come, the job gets destroyed. If X is below R, it continues if X is greater than R. Okay? So that's kind of the simultaneous validity of those two equations means you have two equations and two unknowns, and the curves are, they're monotonic. So the JD curve is upward sloping, the JC curve is downward sloping. You have one intersection, and that's what we have. So we can actually take that as a basis for some comparative statics exercise. But we should first understand what this is saying. This is kind of a statement about given productivity of work of the job, which is P, given this productivity at the very top. Okay, so this is giving an additional degree of freedom to think about what would happen if you had generalized productivity improvements in the economy. What if P went up by 50%? What would that do to the curves? You can actually start telling the story right away, but you can see that it affects both curves. We won't do that right now, but we'll talk about some other possible exercises. But you can also see that the incidence of the shock, lambda, matters. It enters both curves. Okay, if you do the comparative statics exercise of increasing lambda, you can see that it's going to shift both. You can actually talk through, we can do that, we can try to talk through some of the, you can also use, like I said, you can use calculus by taking a total derivative of both of those conditions and then solving for the effect of any exogenous change on R or theta. Okay, we call that comparative statics analysis. All right, so that'd be like if I asked you what would be the effect of increasing B in this model. Okay, so you look at the thing, where do you see B? Where does B show up in this diagram? Okay, logically, okay, one question would be, does it affect the firm's job creation margin? Okay, just looking at that equation, you see that it's not there. It's not in the JC curve. Implicitly, it may be driving theta and R in equilibrium, but it's not a part of that condition. It's certainly a part of the job destruction condition. And the logic of that would be, on the right-hand side of that JD curve expression is the value of workers being unemployed. So if you're unemployed, what do you get? You have a possibility of getting a job. You also have this benefit every period. So the higher that benefit is, the more likely your demands, once you get into a match, will be sufficiently high to make it uninteresting for the firm to continue operations. So you'll have the worker has more bargaining power, will have a higher wage. It also means that in the end the firm will be less interested in keeping the job going, and the workers you have to have mutual agreement. The firms split the match with the workers. So the higher B is, the more tenuous the match is going to be. So if you do, again, comparative statics would say take a total derivative, derive d theta dB or dr dB, but we can do it in our heads. Okay, so you can see that JC is not affected by B, but JD is. And if we raise B on the right-hand side, B is a constant. So if you raise B on the right-hand side, what do we need to do to understand where the curve is going? So why don't we do this? Why don't we say let's hold theta constant. Okay, so let's keep theta constant. And then we'll ask what happens if we raise B. Do you think the curve will move up or will it move down? Just kind of stare at it. This is called visual comparative statics. I mean, you can use okay, you get the same answer if you do the other thought experiment. You can say, holding R constant, what happens if I increase B? Okay, B doesn't appear on the left-hand side, it only appears on the right-hand side. Okay, so if I hold R constant, then this whole left-hand side is constant. So what's going to happen to the curve? Is it going to move to the right or to the left? B goes up. What does theta have to do to make the right-hand side continue to equal the left-hand side? I think it has to go down, doesn't it? Right? Now you use calculus, you can prove that. Right? It's easy to prove that, but just thinking about it would tell us an increase in B would cause this JD curve to shift upwards to the left. Okay, so that's an easy example of what we call comparative statics analysis. And you can see what's going to happen. If we increase call it the unemployment benefit, the income and unemployment, it's going to cause the JD curve to shift to the left, and it's going to cause the equilibrium value of theta to go down. Okay, so that means that vacancies per unemployed worker will fall. Okay, at the same time, R is going to increase, so the critical threshold for productivity has to be higher in that new world. It's kind of a no-brainer because the workers have better options now. They got twice as much unemployment income. So if a bad shock comes, the firm knows and the worker knows that this is not going to work because I can always get my benefit. Okay, so the shift of the curve is to the left. So you can turn this on its head and say, okay, what would happen if we reduced the benefit? What if we reduced unemployment income? That would be a rightward shift of the JD curve to the right. And the JC curve is not changed. Okay, so what happens? Theta increases. Why? Because firms are posting more vacancies, because workers are asking for lower wages, because in a Nash outcome the wage is lower because the worker has a lower fallback position. Okay? So that's an immediate effect. You have higher, so you have something like we observe in Germany right now. This is a great way of interpreting the Hartz reforms. Right? It hurt in terms of benefit, but now firms are complaining they can't find any workers. They're posting vacancies like crazy. So that's a nice kind of way of organizing what we think happened in the Hartz reform. It's part of what happened. Okay, so you can think of a leftward shift as an increase in the benefit. Rightward shift would be a decrease in the benefit. Okay, any questions about that? And the idea is simple, that there's the threshold changes. So the jobs become, in this case, they become more fragile. Jobs become less fragile in the other case. So one of the most interesting things about the Hartz reforms that no one talks about is that the job separation rate has fallen like a stone in Germany. Okay, so firms are clinging to their workers. They're probably giving them all sorts of super, benefits, and one interpretation is that this mutual separation margin has gone down, this sort of threshold. Okay, so we can tell that story. We can tell another story. We can talk about bargaining power of workers. Right? So what happens if you increase beta? Beta is the Nash, generalized Nash workers' bargaining power in this model. Beta goes from between 0 and 1, including the endpoint. So if beta is 0, workers have no power. If beta is equal to 1, workers get everything in the Nash bargain. Okay, so 50-50 is probably a good starting place to think about this. All right, so this is a great example. A lot of people don't like the Hartz interpretation of German unemployment coming down, they think it's because unions got more compliant or docile or less aggressive. Okay, that's another possibility. So we can use the MP model to think about that. Okay, so let's stare at those equations. What do you see now? Let's go back to the beginning. So now we have an equilibrium, and all of a sudden, beta. What do I want to consider beta? I think I want to make beta increasing. Just want to remind myself what I did here. Okay, so beta goes up. Look at those curves. Both of them are affected by beta. Okay, the job creation margin is affected by beta because, in a sense, the firm creates a job or posts a vacancy if the prospective share of a surplus on average is going to be sufficient. So if workers have really lots of bargaining power and take most of the surplus, why post a vacancy? Right? So it's not going to happen. So you can imagine it's going to affect the JC curve, and indeed it shows up there. You want to talk through it? Let's talk it through. Is beta on the left-hand side? No. It's on the right-hand side. So if I hold theta constant and I raise beta, what happens? Well, the curve's going to shift. So which way does it shift? Beta goes up, then 1 minus beta goes down. So what do I have to do to R holding theta constant?
R has to go down.
I think it has to go down. So that would imply that the curve is shifting, right? It means, is it shifting up or down? I think it's shifting down. Okay, so let's keep that filed away. We think JC is going to shift down. And if JD didn't change, that would be easy to figure out, right? But it's not, life is never easy in these things. So JD is going to change too. So this JD turned out to be pretty easy. Holding everything constant on R, if I increase beta, what's going to happen to theta? Okay, my theta is the bargaining power, and the left-hand side is constant, so if I increase beta, it means the numerator is going up, the denominator is going down, so the whole thing is going up. So what has to happen to theta?
It has to go down.
It has to go down too. So the hope is both of those curves shift back, and that's fortunately what I did an hour ago. I think I got it right. Okay, so both curves shift to the left. So what do you see? What is the unambiguous outcome of this increase in workers' bargaining power? What's unambiguous? No doubt.
Theta has to go down.
Right.
But we don't know anything about R.
Right. So, again, we have to be honest in economics. We don't always have the answers, but we certainly have this one. In this setup, labor markets are going to become a lot less tight. Right? But what happens to the fragility of the job is not clear. It depends on which curve shifts by more, so you have to actually look at the magnitude of the shifts. So you have to do the comparative statics using calculus and maybe even calibrate the model. And sometimes you're lucky. Maybe one parameter is so small that it just knocks out one of the effects. Okay, that's possible. Unfortunately, it's not always like that in economics. Okay, so we got this somewhat, problematic answer. But certainly you have an increase in labor market slackness. Okay, theta goes down. Labor markets are not so great. Lots of unemployed workers per vacancy, or lots of applicants. Firms love this. Firms love theta when it's low because it's really, really, really easy to get a worker, and workers don't like that. So they have this conflict. So you can also tell the story what would happen, and this is the nice thing about economics. There's another hand. Okay, so what happens if workers' power? The paradox: the workers' bargaining power goes down, means that the JD curve shifts to the right. Okay, firms find it very attractive prospectively to post vacancies because they can capture more of the surplus. The JC curve shifts to the right. The JD curve shifts to the right because it's less likely that jobs will be destroyed given a realization of the X. That critical threshold goes down. Okay, so this sounds, paradoxically, workers lose power on the bargaining, but they actually get more job offers. Right? So the answer would be both those curves shift to the right, and you'd have a tightening of labor markets. Theta goes up. The probability of finding a worker from the perspective from the firm goes down, and workers lap it up, right? They have lots of offers, but maybe wages aren't doing so well. It depends on the wage equation, but if theta goes up unambiguously, the wages will be higher. Okay, so that, again, looking at the Hartz reforms, a lot of people say it wasn't the Hartz reforms, it was all about unions being more compliant in Germany, more interested in job protection instead, or job preservation, and that would imply tight labor markets, right? So that kind of works too, doesn't it? Okay, so let's talk about something else in the Hartz reforms quickly. People said the Hartz reforms was about Hartz 3, which is about placement. So if you go to it's now called the Agentur für Arbeit. It used to be called the Arbeitsamt. It's like Postamt, it's like putting in a postage stamp. Now you get a little ticket, and they treat you like a customer. They call you a client. Kunde, they call it. You know, it's like you're a customer. And this is part of what the famous, what was his name? Frank? Who's the president of the Bundesagentur für Arbeit? Senior moment. Famous guy, super guy. He actually was, he carried through with the Hartz reforms. He actually reformed the Arbeitsagentur. He supervised the computerization of the jobs that are available across Germany. So if you're unemployed in Berlin, you can find out what's available in what's his name?
Frank-Jürgen Weise.
Weise, yeah. Okay, so Weise is a really super wise guy. I mean, really, he did it, man. I mean, he actually. So you think about, how could you think about his reforms in this setup? Well, this actually was Hartz 3, increasing the efficiency of the employment agencies. Again, if you think about what it did, it affected the matching function. So it affects Q, and the Q doesn't appear anywhere in the JD curve. It only appears in the JC curve. It kind of affects the probability of getting a job. Getting a job if you're looking for work, or getting a worker if you're looking for a job. So you can work through the algebra here. It's like increasing Q, and that would cause, that's the same thing as asking given Q to increase R. It would cause the curve to shift out. So what happens is that, ironically, you have tighter labor markets. The tightness of labor markets causes workers to ask for higher wages, which make labor matches actually more fragile, right? So the workers know they can get a job like that, so they ask for more. In this model, that means workers actually get higher wages, which is kind of a good thing. I mean, I don't want to say it's a good thing because it's a good thing, but it's a good thing in this model in terms of an outcome we can actually predict. And it also means that jobs on average will be a little bit more fragile because, you know, given that a job breaks up, it's easier to find another one, and people are willing to start looking some more. Okay, so I'd like to finish. There's just 3 examples of, you could spend your whole semester thinking about different things you can change in the stripped down model. Okay, you can think about the vacancy posting cost C. You can think about the interest rate. It's kind of boring. You can think about lambda, all fair game for this model. Okay, or productivity. So productivity is a very interesting one. Because productivity appears in both. And the reason it appears on both is because the job creation condition has the vacancy posting cost is independent of productivity. Okay, so if you think about it, what if the vacancy posting cost depended on how productive the workers were? Then P would cancel out in that JC curve, and then only JD would be moving. Okay, in the right direction. So when productivity goes up at x equals 1, that would cause the JD curve to shift down, and workers would be sought after because a vacancy posting is really a profitable thing, and that in the end that would mean higher wages. It would also mean more profits for the firms, at least until entry occurred. So it's a nice model to think about. So now let's criticize it. In the last 5 minutes, let's think about some reasons why we can criticize this model. So I'm just going to tell you what maybe you have some other criticisms that you could think of, but there are 3 interesting critiques that you could make about this model. The first is the way the wage is determined. It's really not a rigid wage. So everything you learned in macro about wage rigidity, this is real rigidity, okay, would not be the case. Because wages are completely flexible. Every instant we can renegotiate the wage. Okay, and even under those conditions, you still have unemployment, right? Because you have to find a job, you have to find a worker, and that's the friction. Okay, but you could complain that the Nash concept is not what we really observe. Most people, what do you think? How do wages get determined in your life? It's interesting, right? It's an interesting question. There's no right or wrong answer, but you should have after some introspection, whenever you've worked for somebody, how did your wage get determined? Did you bargain? Yeah.
It depends. Sometimes you can bargain. Sometimes it's a take it or leave it offer, basically. And empirics show that different people re-bargain their wages in different periods. So like there are people who come like every 4 weeks to try to re-bargain, and also people who only every 12 months try to re-bargain their wages.
So there may be limitations in your contract. It might say you can only bargain every 6, 12 months or whatever, or 2 years. Some union contracts are 2 years long or 3 years long. So that's possible. Bargaining, that's another thing. I mean, you said the other is take it or leave it. So that to me is the most interesting alternative, is the firm just calls out the wage. It's a take it or leave it, okay? And of course the firm may get it wrong and ask for, just offer you a really lousy wage, and everybody just runs away. So that's the firm's fault. We're going to talk about that. It's called the wage posting model. That's kind of what I think is really realistic. You think about it. We like to think about supply and demand, but we're beyond supply and demand in this course. If you're posting a wage, this is an alternative strategy. The firm says, okay, I'm hiring anyone who wants to work for 15 euros an hour. Sounds pretty good, but maybe you could do better if you go around the block. Okay, but you got to find that guy first. Which block? How far do you have to go? Yeah.
Right, there's a take it or leave it offer really means that the firm determines the wage, because if a union, for example, bargained it for you,
right,
then a take it or leave it offer could just be the result of a bargain.
Good. Okay, so the other alternative could be it's not the firm setting the wage, but the worker sets the wage. A worker could have a union that is so powerful that it says, you want to hire our people, you have to pay 15. And if you want to pay 14, we're just not going to work, period. Or you could have possibly a bargain, a Nash bargain at a higher level. So you might have a wage that's being somehow determined from outside the match. So regardless of what S is, regardless of what X is, and that's kind of what we think the world looks like. So you have an industry-wide bargain, and you have firms that may be productive or less productive, and the less productive workers have to pay this wage, okay, despite the fact that their productivity is lousy. Okay, we call that centralized bargaining or industrial level bargaining, which means that some firms may go out of business, right? And then the model doesn't work anymore because the worker would love to work at that wage, because it's an average wage for the entire sector, but my firm is doing very badly. Okay, and then you can have disagreement. That's why we go back to the original point at the beginning of the lecture, that when you get away from the Nash concept, you can have disagreement. And I say, you're out of here, you're fired, like Trump, but you say, well, I'm doing a great job here. I love my job, I'm getting paid, I'm getting a great wage, so I don't want you to fire me. So you have this disagreement. You can't have that in the Nash concept, but you can certainly have it if you have some sort of rigidity or inflexibility. Okay, so the second critique is deep. It's about using the matching function. A lot of people think that the world is much more complicated than this bathtub, that the water that comes in first may actually get out first because you have the right signal. You haven't been unemployed for a long time. you can show that. Some people don't even like to become unemployed at all because it's a bad signal. And if that's the case, being unemployed, the duration of unemployment may matter, and also the flow may behave differently from the stock. Okay, so people who just come into unemployment will have a very quick, it's called the flow approach. It's controversial, and you need to think hard about the micro foundations. We'll talk about that next week probably, or the weeks after. And finally, the critique is this idea that no jobs are rejected. We cooked the model. Mortensen Pissery's model is they're both cooked, that if you come together, you will always have a job and an employment relationship. Okay, but in fact, we know that people reject job offers, and firms reject workers. So the world is much more complicated, and that would be a reason to stick around, come back next week, and talk about search theory. So we'll try to talk about and this again, I really urge you to look at this article, this review article by Rogerson, Scheimer, and Wright. It's in the Journal of Economic Literature. It's a fantastic article. It's almost like a textbook. It takes you through the entire litany of models dealing with these issues. Okay, starting with simple search that Mortensen and McCall thought of in the 1970s. So Mortensen got the Nobel Prize for a lot of different things, not just what he did with Pissarides. He was the first guy to think about what we call sequential search. And the alternative to sequential search is what we call non-sequential search, logically, which is like saying you're going to go, you want to buy some socks, okay? How many stores should you visit? Okay, so you're going to sit down and solve some optimization problem and write down 6. I'm going to visit 6 different stores, or I'm going to visit 6 different websites, and I'm going to stop. Okay, that's called non-sequential search. And theoretically, you could do it if you have bots working for you. You could do it at the same time, right? You can literally. Some people actually can probably do this. I can't. But for me, I probably do sequential search. I go from one shop to the next. Okay, so think about that problem. We'll talk about it next week. Okay, so have a good one.